A baker's dozen means 13. Every English speaker knows that. But almost everything you have heard about why it means 13 is probably wrong. The real story goes deeper than fines and free loaves, and it starts in the chaotic, flour-dusted markets of medieval England. To understand why bakers started counting differently, you need to understand what bread meant in medieval Europe. This was not a side dish. This was survival. For the vast majority of people living in England during the 1200s and 1300s, bread was the primary source of calories. If bread was scarce, people starved. If bread was adulterated or short-weighted, people went hungry while paying full price. This made bread a political commodity, not just a food. The English crown understood this perfectly. As early as 1266, Parliament passed the Assize of Bread and Ale, one of the oldest pieces of consumer protection legislation in English history. The law set strict regulations on the weight, price, and quality of bread sold in markets. If the price of grain went up, the price of bread could rise, but the weight had to stay consistent. Bakers were not operating in a free market. They were operating under the eye of royal inspectors called alletasters and bread weighers, men whose entire job was to catch you cheating. And the punishment for short-weighting your bread was not a fine. It was humiliation. A baker caught selling underweight loaves could be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, with the offending loaf tied around their neck. This was public, physical, and reputationally devastating. In a world where your livelihood depended on your neighbors trusting you, that kind of shaming could end a business permanently. So here's where things get genuinely complicated because the phrase baker's dozen does not have a clean, documented origin story. No single baker coined it. No royal decree defined it. No chronicler wrote the moment it appeared. The phrase surfaces in the written English records, but its roots are murky in ways that actually tell us something interesting about how language works. The earliest clear appearance of baker's dozen in print comes from the 16th century, though historians believe the practice it describes is older. In 1599, a pamphlet recorded the phrase in passing, treating it as already familiar, already established, already something readers would recognize without explanation. That is an important signal. When a writer uses a phrase without defining it, that phrase has been around long enough to feel obvious. It was not new in 1599. Now, the Assize of Bread, passed under Henry III in 1266, is the legal framework everyone points to. And the connection makes intuitive sense. Royal Inspector William de Stortford, who served in London markets during the late 1200s and was one of the documented enforcers of bread laws in city records, would have been exactly the kind of official bakers feared. Men like him had real power. They could seize goods, impose penalties, and report violations to city courts. London court records from the 1280s show cases of bakers penalized for selling loaves found to be short in weight by even small margins. The practice that likely gave rise to the phrase was this. When a baker sold a dozen loaves to a wholesale bread seller called a huckster or regrader, they would often add an extra loaf. The 13th loaf served as a buffer. If the inspector weighed the batch and found any loaf slightly under, the extra covered the difference. The huckster might keep the extra loaf as profit, or the batch average would pass inspection. Either way, the baker was protected. There are records from Worstead in Norfolk and from the city guilds of London suggesting that bread sold in bulk to resellers routinely came in quantities of 13 counted as 12, with the 13th being the dealer's margin. This was not charity. It was commercial logic. The baker sold 12, the reseller got 13, and everyone had a cushion against the law. What makes this history genuinely interesting is that no single person invented this. It emerged from a system, from the grinding pressure of medieval food law, applied to thousands of small bakers operating across decades. The phrase baker's dozen crystallized a practice so widespread it became its own unit of counting. Here's the version most people learn, the one on food blogs and pub quiz cards everywhere. Medieval bakers were terrified of fines, so they added a 13th loaf to every dozen as a buffer against being caught short-weighting. That story is mostly right in spirit, but wrong in the details in ways that matter. First, the extra loaf was not typically given to ordinary customers. The practice was specifically tied to wholesale transactions between bakers and the middlemen who resold bread in markets. Your average person buying a loaf at a stall was not getting 13 for the price of 12. Second, the fines themselves, while real, are often exaggerated in popular retellings. The more viscerally effective punishment was physical humiliation, not a financial penalty. The dragging through the streets, the loaf around the neck, that was what bakers were trying to avoid. The social cost, not just the monetary one. Third, and most importantly, the phrase baker's dozen does not appear in the Assize of Bread itself. There's no law that says, thou shalt add a 13th loaf. The phrase comes from the commercial culture that formed around the law, not from the law directly. It is a folk solution to a legal problem encoded in language long after the specific practice that created it had faded. The phrase is genuinely alive today, not as a quaint historical curiosity, but as active commercial language. Donut shops run baker's dozen promotions. Bagel delis in New York still count 13 as a dozen by default. Wholesale food suppliers use the term in pricing sheets. When a coffee chain offers a 13th punch free on a loyalty card, they are participating in a tradition that traces back to medieval London market stalls, even if their marketing team has no idea. In American English especially, baker's dozen carries a tone of generosity, of getting a little more than you paid for. It has shed its origins in fear and legal compliance and taken on warmth. That transformation is itself a kind of etymology, the way a word's emotional weight can completely reverse over centuries while the form stays the same. The phrase also lives in technical and professional slang. Printers historically used it. Certain trade guilds applied it to batches of goods beyond bread. Any time a profession needed a way to say we are including extra for safety margin, the baker's dozen was there as a ready-made concept. The word dozen itself comes through Old French dozaine, from douze, meaning 12, which traces back to Latin duodecim, simply 2 and 10. The number 12 had deep cultural weight in medieval Europe. 12 apostles, 12 months, 12 inches and a foot. Counting in 12s, called duodecimal counting, was practical because 12 divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, and 6, making it far more useful for merchants splitting goods than our base 10 system. The word assize that names the bread law comes from Old French assize, meaning a sitting or session related to the act of judges sitting in court. An assize was fundamentally a legal assembly, and the Assize of Bread was named for the parliamentary sitting that produced it, not for any specific measurement. Huckster, the word for those bread resellers who received the extra loaf, has its own strange journey. It likely comes from a Low German or Dutch word meaning to peddle or hawk goods. By the time it reached modern English, it had acquired a strongly negative meaning: someone who sells aggressively and dishonestly. The bread resellers of medieval England, who were legitimate middlemen protected by law, would not recognize what their job title eventually became. What all of this shows is that the baker's dozen is not really about bakers, not primarily. It is about the intersection of law, commerce, fear, and social pressure that shapes how ordinary